Medicine Challenge webinar. We're here to try and answer any of your questions about this unique and exciting new MRC initiative, which has so far been running for the last 2 years, and this is the final 1-year span of the exercise. But the reason we're having this seminar and webinar is to try and get over the idea that this is a really exciting new area to do research. I think the important thing to remember is that experimental medicine is using the human being as the resource for uncovering novel mechanistic pathways relating to human disease. And of course, this can lead to proof of concept discoveries, but also can lead to new hypotheses being generated and reverse translation into model systems. The ideal thing, of course, is that experimental medicine is part of the journey in moving discovery science into clinical development. And of course, we are hopeful that any work that is invested in here will lead on to further developments. Experimental medicine is core to the MRC's current research strategy, particularly in translational research. And it's also important to recognize that model-based research is still the cornerstone of MRC activity. And this really is an extension of this, using the human being, of course, as the model, rather than in vitro or animal test systems. It really is about discovery science in humans, using new tools, new ways of probing a resilient human to explore pathways that may be exposed in human disease, and to try and understand how human disease really works under sometimes quite complex conditions. The United Kingdom has a fantastic infrastructure for delivering human-based studies. In fact, we're almost unique in the world in this respect. And our biomedical research units and centres, as well as the large infrastructures that MRC has invested in recent times, will provide, we hope, a very, very novel way of introducing this novel way of exploring human disease. We ultimately expect that the experimental challenge grants will lead to novel discoveries. And of course, what we want are new therapies, new diagnostics, and in the end, ways that are going to influence patient benefit. So please allow me now to introduce the panel who's sitting around the table. My name is Stephen Holgate, and I chair this panel, of course, and also the Translational Research Group at the MRC.
So I'm David Lomas, I'm Chair of the Population and Systems Medicine Board at MRC, and we see some of these grants when they come through for review.
Thank you, David.
I'm David Crosby, I'm MRC's Programme Manager for Experimental Medicine, and it's my job to be the primary point of contact with the academic community for this call.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Steve Williams. I'm a researcher at the University of Manchester, and I'm representing a collaboration who was successful in getting one of these grants in the first time round, collaboration between Manchester, Nottingham and Cardiff universities. It's based around neuroimaging.
So this is the team which we hope will be able to answer some of your questions. But before doing that, we're going to cover some of the bases first that I hope sets a framework for your questions. So, David.
Thanks, Steve. Firstly, if I could remind you all that we are open for submission of questions now. The email address for those questions is mrcg@headoffice.mrc.ac.uk. It's the address that's on the webpage that I believe you're looking at right now. So feel free to submit questions throughout the rest of the webinar, which we'll be addressing towards the end of the session. We will be addressing those questions anonymously, so feel free to ask any questions you like. They won't be attributed to you. So, as Stephen says, experimental medicine has been a pillar of MRC's strategy, and will continue to be so over the coming spending period. And while this particular competition, the Experimental Medicine Challenge Grants, was envisaged as a 3-year program in the first instance, experimental medicine will continue to be a priority for MRC. And indeed, we already fund experimental medicine through a number of complementary routes, because the concept of experimental medicine goes from basic mechanistic discoveries in human subjects through to the development of interventions and diagnostics in a more sort of orthodox early stage clinical trial area. This call is focused on the former, but we have a number of complementary routes of funding. For example, the Developmental Pathway Funding Scheme, which covers the more translational phases of experimental medicine, and the infrastructural investments that we've made recently through the Clinical Research Infrastructure Call. And as we go forward, MRC will continue to have this complementary approach to cover the various aspects of experimental medicine. So I'm just going to at least attempt to put some slides up for you now that I'll talk through. Forgive me while I struggle with the technology. And there we are. Okay, so here's the email address once again for you if you'd like to send in the questions. Now, in the blue box there, we've defined experimental medicine as investigation undertaken in humans, rating where appropriate to model systems, to identify mechanisms of pathophysiology or disease, or to demonstrate proof of concept evidence of the validity and importance of new discoveries or treatments. And that's essentially a more eloquent way of expressing what I've just attempted to convey, that the scope of experimental medicine is broad, from mechanistic through to development of therapies. Now, as Stephen mentions, the core ethos of this particular grant is man as the experimental model, that we're encouraging the development of an ethos of discovery science in humans. And that as we have moved into the 21st century, we now have the tools at our disposal to enable us to take a high resolution look into the former black box of human physiology to really understand the mechanisms of pathophysiology. So what we hope for from these grants is that the experiments that you will conduct should inform a deeper understanding of human disease mechanism. They should lead through to better target identification, better target validation, thereby supporting more efficient translation, and also reverse translation to more representative animal models and better basic science. So the implication there is that this is not a linear progression. Experimental medicine isn't just a step on a path from basic to translational science, but there's a reciprocal relationship, and experimental medicine should inform basic science just as much as translation. And this diagram, which is on the website, attempts to try and convey that, the cyclical relationship and the centrality of experimental medicine in a wider scientific picture, which is supported by and supports various priority areas of science for MRC and for the UK. So what are MRC looking for? What should an experimental challenge grant be? Well, we're looking for large-scale collaborative awards to support ambitious, groundbreaking, challenge-led experimental medicine work. And all of this is aimed at getting new insights in disease mechanism in humans. So that's the core of it, disease mechanism in human subjects. We want these grants to be challenge-led. We want you to have the courage to take on a major unanswered question in disease mechanism. We want these grants to be human-focused. This is about an experiment in human subjects, which David Lomas will elaborate on in the next talk. We want these to be ambitious and innovative. We want you to address questions in new ways. We want them to be experiment-driven. So at the core of every application, we expect there to be some kind of experiment in human subjects which, with positive or negative results, tells you something about the disease mechanism. So I'll talk a little now about who and what MRC will support through this scheme. We want to support a range of award sizes. We have a Pathfinder stream. The Pathfinder stream is intended to support grants of approximately less than 1.2 million, and these should be the most ambitious and progressive pieces of science, which perhaps don't have an established platform or a significant platform of preliminary data, but are really pursuing the most progressive ideas, and therefore have a commensurately lower budget. For the full-scale experimental medicine challenge grants, that's anything above 1.2 million. And we're expecting to fund a range of proposals. They don't all have to be at the very highest end. It should be commensurate with the science that you're proposing. We would like to support various different individuals, different sort of phenotypes of investigator to conduct experimental medicine. So these are not just awards necessarily for very established senior clinical academics. We expect basic scientists to be involved in these. We expect some less established investigators to be coming through with these progressive ideas as well. And again, the scale of funding you request should be appropriate for that. At their core, experimental medicine challenge grants, we expect them to be hypothesis defining or refining. So this isn't about purely observational characteristic studies, but equally, this, as I emphasized previously, it's not about a linear march towards an intervention. If during the course of your study you are getting preliminary evidence of efficacy or safety of a potential therapy, that's appropriate, but it's not mandatory. What do we expect from these applications? Detail of experimental plans is key. We expect partnership, as Stephen mentioned. There are opportunities for capitalising on research infrastructure, which David will elaborate on. There are opportunities for inter-institution, interdiscipline and international collaboration, all of which are entirely appropriate as the science requires. And lastly, we are interested in supporting collaboration with industry. And several of the previous EM Challenge grants have capitalised on the availability of tool compounds, for example, to probe mechanism. And indeed, we have a new asset sharing initiative, and the link is on your screen there, which has made available a pool of deprioritised compounds from industry, which are now freely available to applicants to MRC funding streams. And we expect these to be utilised in a number of experimental challenge grant applications. Again, it's not mandatory, but if you have a look through the compounds available there, there may be something which will help you address your mechanistic question. Risk mitigation is important. We certainly recognise that due to the very experimental and progressive nature of these grants, that they will involve scientific risk, that the results you get aren't as anticipated, and that's okay. But we certainly want you to be cognizant of those risks and to have thought through them, and where possible to articulate plans to mitigate those risks. So essentially, what's your plan B? If you don't get the results as anticipated in the early stages of the work, how will you then progress? What are the alternate strategies you can employ? We'd also ask you to think through what you would need to establish before embarking on the higher cost parts of the programme. What are the requisite level of evidence you're going to need to progress through each stage, and what stage gates and milestones might be appropriate. Quick thought on pilot data. As with any grant application, the presence of pilot data to give some validation to the concepts you're proposing is important, but when, especially in the Pathfinder stream, you're addressing a major unknown, it's expected that there may not be such a solid platform of pilot data as you would normally anticipate for a project grant, for example. We would like to support novel approaches, and this is really key. New science facilitated by new technology and new experimental designs. And this could be things like new imaging modalities, it could be integrative computational models. There are a variety of approaches you can use, and we encourage those where appropriate. So lastly, I'll just talk very briefly about the mechanism for reviewing these. The first stage is outline submissions. As you all know, we have the deadline on the 25th of June. Those will then be shortlisted by a panel of existing MRC board members and chairs, and that will happen towards the end of July. So if you're invited to submit a full proposal at the end of July, your deadline will be around the end of October. Those proposals will be sent out for peer review, external peer review, as for standard grant applications. And then the externally reviewed full applications will then be reviewed by a cross-board experimental medicine panel chaired by Stephen Holgate. And that panel will be composed of existing MRC board members from across the remit of the MRC, which we have designed to encourage and to best support multidisciplinary proposals, essentially, that can span various different territories within the MRC spectrum. So you can expect decisions, final funding decisions, in February 2016. Okay, so if I can switch hopefully back to the camera. And there we are.
Thanks very much indeed, David. And obviously there'll be some questions that will flow from some of those comments that you may wish to be framing now. But I'm going to introduce David on my right this time, David Lomas, who's going to tell us a little bit about his experience on the scheme so far. David.
Thank you, Stephen. So we've seen quite a few of these applications through the board, and we've learned the sort of things that are likely to be successful. So when you put your application together, think about the question you're asking and make sure it's a really important question. If the experiment works, then what will be the step change in understanding? And when you put your proposal together, think about the unique selling point of your proposal or your grouping. What do you have and what can you do that no one else in the world can do? Because that will play very well during the review process. I like to think about this as taking human subjects that are very well characterized, or systems that are very well understood with very clear outcomes, and then perturbing that system with a series of challenges. And those challenges may be small molecules, they may be antibodies, they may be vaccines, and they may be behavioral interventions, or they may even be experiments of nature, things like trauma or infection. But the clear thing is that there's an intervention, an experiment, and that there's a clear outcome that you can measure. Another way of looking at the applications is to develop new outcomes such as imaging techniques, so new imaging markers that allow you to define disease processes. But at all times, this is a mechanism-based approach. So think about the mechanistic processes that underlie the disease or the process, and how you can intervene and what the outcomes may be. One other approach that I think has been successful is to take a group of patients that may be stratified by genotype or by proteomic or metabolomic analysis. And that allows you to look at a well-characterized group of subjects in whom you can then intervene with a small molecule, for example, a repurposed drug, an antibody, or even a behavioral therapy. When you put your proposal together, think very carefully about statistics. Can I encourage you to seek the advice of a statistician at the outset? Ideally, have them as a co-applicant, or ask them to write a letter of support justifying the numbers. Please do that early on in the process, because the boards look very carefully at the numbers and the power calculations. The things that don't work and don't play well with the board are, I have a large cohort of subjects and now I'd like to undertake a metabolomic study, or I'd like to undertake a proteomic study, or even a GWAS. Because whilst they're appropriate for program grants or project grants, they're not appropriate for this type of program, because they look to the board like a large fishing trip. The other things that don't play well are very expensive grants where the costs are not clearly justified, and huge numbers of principal investigators. I've seen applications with 10 or 15 PIs, and if you're going to do that, then you need to tell me what each of these people are doing and to justify the costs associated with their involvement with the study. And finally, I'd like to encourage you to use the existing infrastructure within the UK. The NIHR is invested in biomedical research centres and platforms. MRC is invested in infrastructure. We have new PET scanners and CT scanners dedicated to research. There's also the National MRC Phenome Centre that you can also think about using. Also think about our existing investments in the FAR institutes and also in our cohorts. Bringing those sort of resources into your application will bring added value. There's already been investment, there's already infrastructure, and then using them to answer the sort of questions that are important to you are likely to be looked on favourably by the board. Thank you.
Good, thank you, David. So now, lastly, in terms of the formal part of this webinar, we've invited Steve Williams to come and give us some insight, really, into what his work has been doing along this line, because he was one of the successful grants in the last round. So, Steve, please.
Thanks. Well, I hope what I'm going to say will reinforce what we've heard in terms of what makes a successful grant. Maybe we're saying that our grant does have a lot of applicants and was towards the top end of the budget, but we did try very hard to make sure that was all justified, and clearly we didn't make that case. Okay, thanks. So when we first saw the call for the MRC Experimental Medicine Challenge. My first thought was, oh, actually, we've got an MRC grant which we put in last year, which we thought was really strong. Maybe we just need to rework that. But then we discussed it internally with colleagues in Manchester, and it became clear that this call was really something rather different to the usual calls for projects and programs. And we really saw the need to ask a very clear question, to probe that question in human subjects, and to make sure it would give us a definitive answer. So on the previous slide, the first slide, so our MRC challenge grant was defining a disturbance in cortical glutamate and GABA function in psychosis, its origins and consequences. And it's a collaboration between ourselves in Manchester and Nottingham and Cardiff universities using advanced neuroimaging techniques. So I thought I'd say a little bit about the process. So we wanted to initially understand the role of glutamate and GABA neurotransmission in schizophrenia. And for this, we are going to use proton and carbon-13 magnetic resonance spectroscopy. We propose to relate this to neuroinflammation and reactive oxygen species. To probe those, we use PET and again proton MRS. But then also to try to tie this together with brain networks and try and understand if the disturbances in neurotransmitters may be related to long-range network oscillations in schizophrenia, for which we used MEG. So it's clear that a program of this breadth couldn't be achieved just by ourselves in one centre. In order to show preliminary data across most of these areas, we really needed a big collaboration. Hence, we engage with colleagues in Nottingham and Cardiff universities. So we're just emphasising what's been shown before. We needed to identify a real need, and this was felt to be a lack of understanding of the basic mechanisms of pathophysiology in schizophrenia at a molecular level. And we needed to show why this was important and how our plan would address this need. Novelty and risk were clearly important. So at the core of this proposal is a completely new approach at that stage to investigations in humans. And that's the use of carbon-13 magnetic resonance spectroscopy in humans to understand neurotransmitter turnover. And at the time we wrote the proposal, although this technique had been applied in humans for probably 10 or 15 years, it had never been applied in a well-defined disease group. And it was something which we in Manchester had no direct experience of, whereas Nottingham did have experience of this. Subsequent to our grant being submitted, the group in Yale have now published a study on the use of this technique in depression. So the collaborators were really important on this. So we have a team at Manchester of psychiatrists with a strong neurobiological perspective and imagers. And in Nottingham, again, we collaborate with psychiatrists, neuroimagers, led by Peter Morris in imaging and Peter Little in psychiatry, and Matt Brooks in MEG. And then in Cardiff, with expertise in magnetic resonance spectroscopy through Krish Singh and his team, and then James Walters, again, bringing experimental psychiatric medicine approach. So the collaborators were really important and essential to get them on board early in the process. So the proposal did contain a clear statement up front of our purpose and what the benefits would bring. And really, I think this is just standard grantsmanship. I mean, grants I review, most people's grants are technically pretty good these days. So enough background to demonstrate the importance, but not just to show off our knowledge. An inclusion of highly relevant preliminary data. But even at the outline stage, we thought it was important to have a very clear experimental plan, really laid out in table form, so it's easy for the referees to understand what we were trying to achieve. So actually, we ended up putting a lot of work into the outline, extensive discussions with co-applicants, emails flying back and forth, and we put in a lot of effort up front in trying to get realistic estimates of the cost. And we basically designed the full study and really wrote the outline like a full application, but without sign-off and costs. And we really tried to show how the three centres were working together and how we were taking advantage of MRC, Welcome, and other infrastructure funding in terms of the imaging capabilities. So we got feedback on the outline. There was relatively limited criticism, but the points which were raised were very important around feasibility, clarity of hypothesis, and some confusion as to whether or not we were proposing a treatment-based study. The panel recognised the application as important, confirmated the strength of our team. In addition to that, Bill Deakin, as the chief investigator, had a very useful discussion with, I think it was Tom Fowkes at the time, who was experimental medicine contact, which really fleshed out the rather limited comments in the email about the panel. But we felt that was very important, and we attempted to address all these questions in the full application. And again, this was very much a collaborative effort, regular telecoms with the other centres, drafts circulated by email, and getting people at all levels involved in helping us draft it. So not just the PIs, but getting postdocs to put in their thoughts and ideas as well. And really getting our research administrators in all three centres involved in the early stage, so we had good costing models. In the end, we did drop one set of experiments, which actually was on animals from the outline, which we felt was probably peripheral to the core aims, and it actually led probably to confusion about some of the therapy aspects. So we thought that gave a bit of clarity to the full application. The referees' responses, they like the innovation, they like the high impact, and they compliment us on the scientific case, the team, and the environment. Because everyone knows who's gone through MRC grants, you can get excellent referee scores, but that basically just gets you to panel. You can't say, well, you know, we're scoring 6s across the board, it's bound to get funded. That's really not the case. So we really had to address the referees' comments. And some of it actually relates to things which obviously we hadn't addressed following the criticism of the outline. Some queries about sensitivity and specificity, and how it's going to work across centres. And questions about effect sizes and power, which I think was brought up earlier by David in terms of statistics. And of course, you know, you only have 2 pages to respond to this. So if you're a long way off the mark, you're really not going to be able to do it in 2 pages. But ultimately, you know, it was funded. Fair to say we were surprised, because we knew that even getting to panel, you know, there's a good chance of not getting funded. And I think probably the most telling aspect was we were proposed to do something which hadn't been done before. And I think in usual project or program grant, that may be viewed as too high risk. But I think here we managed to persuade the panel that there was a risk-benefit trade-off here. So just finally, to wrap up, David Crosby, when he asked us to put together this talk, gave us sort of a few key questions which he wanted me to address. So how did we get the idea for the core question? So it's about a lack of good mechanistic model to explain symptoms in schizophrenia, combined with our interest in the role of the primary neurotransmitters glutamate and GABA. Evidence in literature that inflammation may be important in the pathogenesis of schizophrenia, and a lot of information, although some of it fairly nebulous, about breakdown of distributed processing networks.
Attention, please. Attention, please.
Okay.
The public address and
I'm
fire
terribly
alarm
sorry, everyone, but
systems
there's
are about to be
a
tested.
fire drill.
Please take no further action.
This is only a drill, so we won't have to leave the building, but we might have to pause for a moment or two and let you listen to some delightful alarm noises. But we are still here, rest assured. And also,
attention please, attention please. Please leave the building by the nearest available exit. Do not use the lifts.
that's not you, that's for us. You can stay where you are. So it's almost finished, but not quite. Yeah, there'll be one more message and then we can carry on. Well, there's usually one more message at least. Do we dare continue? Steve?
Okay, well, hopefully you've had the opportunity to read my slide, which actually does reiterate some of the points which I brought up earlier. But actually, we go to the second column. How do we plan the studies and ensure they're mapped onto and delivered against the objectives? So we designed a study looking at 3 groups.
The testing of the public address and fire alarm systems are now complete. If you had difficulty hearing any of these messages, please inform Customer Services Help Desk.
I expect you didn't have difficulty in hearing that, but thanks anyway.
Yeah, so an experimental study in healthy controls and early onset and established disease, and recognizing difficulty of recruiting subjects into schizophrenia studies, hence 3 centres. And then we have inbuilt replication, so 2 or 3 centres were undertaking each of the measurements, with the exception of the PET measurement, which was only done in Manchester. And really a very clear definition of the outputs and the hypotheses from these studies. I think I've sort of briefly explained the responses of referees, which were reinforced by the panel, which we addressed before the panel meeting. And the referees clearly looked first at importance, innovation and impact, and only subsequently to that did they ask themselves the questions, will these experiments work? And obviously we had to show there's a good chance they would work, but I think without the importance and the innovation and the impact, we wouldn't have got as far as full application. So thanks for your attention. I hope that was clear despite the fire alarm.
Good. Well, thanks very much, Steve. And some will know that the last time we had a fire alarm here, there was a real fire, and we all had to get out quickly. But unfortunately, that isn't the case now. So David Crosby is going to help us now with the various questions you've sent in, and I think what his intention is to field those questions to individuals, and we'll do our best to answer them, and we'll take them one by one as we go along. We've had some grouping of questions under particular headings, so it might be sensible to try and look at a group of questions relating to a particular topic rather than jumping backwards and forwards into different areas. So David, I'll let you now run this section.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to everyone who has sent the questions in. If we can, I'll firstly start by saying that the slides from earlier in the presentations will be available. If you want those, do just drop me an email and I'll send them to you. Secondly, the entire webinar will also be available offline later or online later on. So if you just essentially return to the page that you're watching now, then there'll be a sort of a continuing link there to this whole session. And so if there are colleagues who missed out on this opportunity, that they'll be able to revisit it later. So if we move into the questions, to what extent do proposals need to include testing of an intervention to be competitive? And would it be sufficient for proposals to focus on an identification of pathways and targets that have causal linkage to disease? So to what extent does there have to be a therapeutically tractable intervention? Almost no extent at all. So while, as David's articulated, we want there to be an experimental intervention that helps you to identify the target and the pathway, that doesn't necessarily have to be directly translatable to a therapy. It can be, and that's great. If you do, develop a potential intervention as part of one of these, that's entirely appropriate. But it's not mandatory. This isn't about just early stage therapeutic development. This is about pinning down mechanism.
And these aren't about observational studies, so different from stratified medicine, for example, which is trying to substratify complex disease. This is about an intervention of some form, provoking the status quo to examine new mechanisms. And so this is how it departs, really, from the stratified medicine initiative that MRC currently supports.
And just to add to that, just describing pathways in more detail won't get you over the bar. There has to be some intervention or experiment that's part of the process. So define things in more detail is what we look for in project and program grant applications.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So the next question is, would a mechanistic model, assessment of biomarkers plus associated pilot trial of a novel agent that targets the hypothesized mechanism be fundable? If I can pass that question, I think essentially yes is the answer. As long as the mechanistic model is in the human subjects.
And this is where these this sort of store of unique chemical compounds might come in particularly useful, that David referred to in his presentation that MRC holds.
Okay. We've had a couple of related questions about mental health. So firstly, how sympathetic are we to supporting psychological models which aim to understand mechanisms underlying aspects of mental illness, such as suicidal thoughts and behaviours? These are absolutely within remit. We're very keen to support work in this area because the core philosophy of the scheme is to take on a mechanistic black box where we just don't understand how disease is working. And I think psychiatric disease could be considered a prime example of that, as Stevenson's grant has illustrated.
But then we need to think what the experiment is. So is the experiment then defining new pathways with new imaging modalities and new outcomes, new metabolic processes, or is it an intervention that follows and then readout? So is it behavior intervention, for example, and then the associated readout? So clearly what the hypothesis is and what's the intervention and what's the experiment that you're describing.
And we had a related question on how this works with mental health. Steve, did you want to?
Yeah, it's just probably worth mentioning what constitutes an experiment and what constitutes a challenge. Because in our study, although we are giving challenges because we're looking at the way the brain handles glucose, that's not really that's not really the experiment. The experiment is to compare how the brain handles glucose in normal subjects, in patients with early onset disease and patients with established disease who have been on medication for a period of time. So the experiment doesn't have to be the intervention.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to David's earlier point about natural experiments. There are certain circumstances in which you can't experimentally induce ethically the particular set of circumstances that you want to find out about mechanism. And trauma is a very good example, and mental health would be another. So I think we had another question around biomarkers. So in mental health, in particular conditions, there are no validated current biomarkers, but a great need for new treatments. And I think that this is orbiting about the same question. That yes, that's still entirely appropriate, and discovering and validating markers of disease which allow you to diagnose, prognose, and stratify could be a really valuable output from an experimental medicine challenge grant.
But I think it's important to just stress what's the mechanism.
Absolutely.
What's the mechanistic process that you're assessing? How is it being determined? However you want to do it, and then can you measure the outcome?
Yeah, I mean, one of the important things about disease, of course, is a breakdown in resilience. And using stressors of different forms, whether they be psychological or whether they be physical or chemical, is a way of testing the breakdown of resilience. And in a way, that's why in chronic difficult disease, this experimental medicine approach is really quite an effective way of uncovering new pathways.
So we've had a related question which asks, while much of the discussion is centered around understanding of disease mechanisms and pathways, would this core consider funding experimental approaches to understanding the mechanism of action and dosing strategies of novel therapeutics or repurposed drugs? Now, while those kind of studies are within the greater spectrum of experimental medicine itself. Those would not be in remit for this particular call. This experimental medicine challenge grant call is focused on disease mechanism. But there are other opportunities to pursue studies like that, and I'd suggest probably the EME program, Efficacy and Mechanism Evaluation, which is co-administered by MRC and NIHR, sits in exactly that kind of space.
And I should just say that Strategy Board has just undergone a review of EME, and the new EME will emerge with much more experimental approaches built into it. So this is an opportunity, I think, for that type of study that David's referred to be supported.
And another related question that we've had around what we consider to be an intervention or an experiment relates to exercise. And given the rapidly growing association between disease progression and inactivity, would we consider exercise intervention studies to be deemed appropriate rather than pharmacological? Yeah. Absolutely. So every time we say experiment or intervention, sometimes there's a sort of tacit assumption that we mean pharmacological. That's very much not the case. So a physiological challenge, an exercise challenge, a psychological challenge, an infectious challenge, all of these are very much within scope. So we've touched on the difference between the stratified medicine program briefly in this call, but Stephen, I mean, having been involved in stratified medicine, would you like to say a bit more about that?
Yes. Well, as many will know, we've supported a number of consortia here, which are networks across the country, really addressing complex disease. And certainly, the Stratified Medicine Initiative is going to continue. And some of you may well be aware that there have been some issues around methodology in stratified medicine. So we are generating a new initiative around improving the methodology around that, but we have supported some good consortia at the moment. So that will be rolling on in parallel with this particular initiative. And I hope, beyond the comprehensive spending review, that stratified medicine and indeed experimental medicine challenges will continue in the future. But obviously, as some will be aware, we've had a general election today, and we're not absolutely certain of the outcomes of all of this. But we're very positive about continuing down this road. The other thing about the Stratified Medicine Initiative, as David Lemus referred to, is that one can already start beginning to select substrata and then use that substrata knowledge to then perturbate a particular pathway to understand more about how that pathway translates into a disease mechanism. So it may be that eventually the stratified medicine and experimental medicine initiative will have some overlap in certain areas.
So we've had a couple of questions through about industry engagement, which I think it might be useful to tackle. Some of the questions have revolved around how we see the role of industrial partners in these applications, and whether are they grant receiving partners, are they non-grant receiving partners, are they in-kind benefactors? There's a range of different models you can employ. I think the core of what we'd like to see is intellectual engagement in the project. We want to see an exchange of ideas, of techniques, of resource between academia and industry that makes the work of both stronger. Now, MRC, the money that you apply for from this grant, MRC funding won't go from us to the company. The company can contribute cash towards the project, and that's always gratefully received, but it's not mandatory. So we consider in-kind contributions from companies towards projects equally valuable to a cash contribution. And that in-kind contribution could take the form of donation of compounds, it could be access to facilities, it could be access to data, and equally it could just be people's time, access to their intellects that support these projects. So any number of those models are entirely appropriate, but it's not just about money.
And industry is not just the pharmaceutical industry, of course, because what we're talking about here are some multi and interdisciplinary approach to complex questions, and obviously that requires different talents from the private as well as the public sector in certain cases. So please use industry as in its broadest capacity. And just on the subject of partnership, industry, of course, is just one set of partners. There may well be other partners. certainly the research charities who have direct patient contact and communicate with patients and the public directly are in a strong position often to help with some of these grant applications as well.
And the research charities have made some fantastic investments in infrastructure for experimental medicine studies, which we'd also very much like to see capitalised upon. So I just said that exercise could be considered as an intervention. I did, but we're not looking at whether it works and its mechanism of action being the EMI remit and not this one. What we're interested in is the mechanism of disease. But if an exercise intervention allows you to introduce a perturbation in the system of the individuals that allows you to test a hypothesis or to build a hypothesis around that challenge, then that's in remit. So it's not whether or not exercise works as a therapy, it's whether an exercise or physiological intervention can tell you about disease mechanism. So we had several international co-investigator questions. Would international collaborators be considered? Yes, absolutely. As with any application for MRC funding, we'll always consider the possibility of people including international collaborators, as long as it's supported by the scientific needs of the project. What we would need you to establish in your application is that the international collaborator brings something to the project which is not replicable within the UK. Be that access to a resource, a drug, a patient population, or their unique expertise on the world stage in a particular facet that's required for the grant. We can send money out overseas to these overseas institutions, direct costs of research only, no indirects or overheads. Again, where it's justified, where you couldn't achieve the same by collaborating within the UK. So we have some questions about what information is required in the outline versus the full application. Somebody asked about how long the outlines are and how necessary are patient groups. The outline length, so we have a pro forma approach for the outlines. So there's a structured outline form that you can download from the website. It's in a number of boxes, and each box addresses different aspects of these awards, the challenge, the background knowledge, the experiment. And there's a word limit stipulated for each of those boxes. I'm afraid I haven't memorized the word limits for each box, but you can see that on the form. Overall, I think the outlines will pan out as being about 4 pages or so, 4 or 5 pages.
Yeah, just a comment on that. I mean, we did spend a lot of time making sure the outline was succinct and made the points we wanted to make. So I don't think we didn't use up the full character score in every box, but we made sure that the characters we did use weren't superfluous. And I think that was absolutely key. Also, it crystallizes your own ideas much more if you have to get them down into 4 pages. So although we did a lot of refinement at the full application stage, the basic ideas were there in the outline. So don't think you can put the outline together the night before and then say, well, we'll work it up when it comes to the full application. That just will not work here.
No, that's absolutely right, and certainly a succinct and punchy message is often more convincing than an overly wordy one. So the second part of that question was about the involvement of patient groups. Now, if you're working with patients, then certainly if a patient support group or something like that exists, then yes, I think it would be a fantastic benefit to the grant to have those involved. It can be a really important aspect of engaging with that community and can help tremendously with recruitment. So we've had a number of questions around the process of the grants. To what extent do we expect multidisciplinary teams to address questions? These grants are multifaceted by their very nature. You know, we're expecting a kind of translation through from basic science ideas into the clinic. We're expecting the use of novel modalities and technologies, and I would imagine it would be highly unusual for a small group of applicants that work together to have all the requisite tools and expertise at their disposal to be able to cover such a sort of diverse programmatic project. So while it's not mandatory for teams to necessarily be multidisciplinary, I mean, it depends on how you define that, of course, but we'd expect there to be a range of expertise involved.
So what worked well for the stratified medicine call and the grants that got good scores were if teams of people got together in a sort of workshop setting where that interdisciplinarity can be well reflected, and all the sort of gremlins discussed actually at that meeting, such that when the outline is put together, as we heard from Steve a few moments ago, it really puts a convincing case, because it's all about convincing the panel and the reviewers, of course, that this is a doable project that's going to deliver.
And on the theme of multidisciplinarity, so absolutely agree that reaching across different disciplines will play very well, but just make sure that every PI that you have on that application has a key role in the program, because it does rack up costs quite quickly, and that can irritate the board members.
Yeah, you want to avoid tokenism. Just having a name on there for a name's sake is transparent. So we've been asked, is there a list of MRC funded resources that might be possible to tap into as part of this grant? There are a number of lists. Certainly there's a website for the recent clinical research infrastructure call. So if you Google that, you'll probably find it, but there's a very nice website that details all of the investments that we made through that in various imaging modalities and other technologies that are available across the country. And those were intended as platform investments. So they're not just a toy for the recipient to play with, they're a resource for the community, and we'd love you to be able to access those. But that's just one set of investments. And I think it's probably important to emphasize that it's not just MRC funded infrastructural investments that we'd like you to utilize. Investments made by NIHR will be really crucial in supporting experimental medicine. And likewise, as we've mentioned, the charities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Will there be another opportunity to subscribe to this call, or is this the last one? So as Stephen mentioned at the outset, this is the third year of a planned 3-year initiative. So it's the last of the current phase of experimental medicine challenge grants. But experimental medicine per se, and the ground that this scheme covers, is core business for the MRC. And that's really what we tried to do with this call, is to flag up how important this area is to MRC. But the plans for exactly how we'll support that are fluid, and we will always have a number of irons in this fire. So whether or not next year there's another call that has exactly the same name is really semantics. I mean, what's important is we will still be supporting work in this space through the boards, through the EMI challenge, through the EMI system, through the DPFS system. So we have a spectrum of funding opportunities that cover this territory.
And going forward, we'd like to see more mechanistic human studies, and this plays very nicely into that space.
Absolutely. We really expect people to be building up a head of steam in doing this kind of disease mechanism work in human subjects, and the applications in that space can, should, and do go through the 4 research boards through our standard response mode mechanisms. What's the upper limit on funding requests? The classic question that I answer 10 times a day, and the answer is always there is no upper limit. We want to fund progressive, ambitious work, and we want the funds that you request to deliver that to be proportionate to the work that you're conducting. So while there isn't an upper limit, value for money is crucial. And there are certain areas of science and certain techniques that just are more expensive. So if it costs X million pounds to deliver the project and to make the mechanistic insights that you propose, that's fine, as long as you explain why that cost is necessary. You will be able to see from the list of grants that we funded previously that we funded a range of different sizes, and it's very much the aspiration that we'll cover a range this time. So we don't want them all to be multi-million-pound monsters. We don't want them all to be small. We've previously funded projects from sort of 800,000 or so all the way up to the high 3 millions, and that's the rough range we look to cover. But the average might be somewhere in the middle.
So if it's around the 3 million mark, it has to be stellar.
Absolutely.
Truly stellar. And every component of an application has to be thought out with and on the critical pathway to delivering the understanding of the new mechanism and the intervention. What we've seen is very high requests for funding in these calls in the past that haven't been completely justified. We've seen high applications where people say, actually, as a nice add-on, perhaps we could do a big metabolomic study. And it's not on the critical pathway to undertake the experimental approach and to find the mechanistic pathway. So just a word of caution, if you're going to be that high, you have to be stellar, and smaller, more focused grants with a clear hypothesis, a clear experiment and clear outcome will probably fare better at the boards.
Remember, there's £15 million in this kitty. And so if we had 2 grants of 7.5 million, you can imagine there would be quite a lot of discussion about that.
That's right. Yeah. And what we saw in the previous rounds is that things often fell down when people had, I suppose, tried to take advantage of the nature of the call being one of ambition by adding superfluous studies, which increased the expense but didn't deliver scientific value or value for money. Is more than one application per institution allowed? Yes, absolutely, yes. We certainly wouldn't seek to constrain the ambition of any given university or institution. We have another question about industry engagement. When calculating the partner's funding contribution, would the value of industries supplying compounds or other contributions to the running of trials be eligible? Yes, absolutely. You know, this isn't just about cash. This is about exchange of ideas and contribution of effort. And indeed, in one of the previous awards from the last round, we took into account not just the value of the compound that the company had contributed, but also the expenditure that they'd made on getting that compound through phase 1 studies. So, you know, industry had already put a lot of money into demonstrating the safety of the compound, and we took that into account when considering their contribution to this project, where the drug was being repurposed in a new area. Okay, we have another question. Back to international collaborators. How would international collaborators compare to national ones? So I suppose what that's asking is, do we consider one preferable to the other? I think that answer would be no. I think that it's about the composition of the team and the expertise that the collaborators bring to it. So regardless of their location, if they are the best people in the world to bring to the grant what that you say they're bringing, then they're the right people.
But it's the best people in the world bit there, not I've worked with X for years and years and years and we'll put the grant in together. That's right, we're a good partner. It's I'm asking X to take part in this because we could only do this by working with X, and therefore we have a unique selling point around this area.
And this is, after all, a UK-led initiative. So obviously the driving force has to come from the UK.
That's right. So we've had a question about the career stage of the PI from somebody who describes themselves as a relatively early career investigator, not yet professorial. Is it worth them applying? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We've had some awardees who have not been professors, and that's entirely appropriate. And as I said previously, you know, we'd expect the ambition of the bid and the scale of the bid to be commensurate with your track record. So, you know, if you're asking for the £3 million monster grant, then we would expect you to have a track record of programmatic support and delivery of such scale projects.
Because we have seen applications in the £2 or £3 million range, and then we look at the track record of the investigator, and the biggest grant they've had in the past is £20,000. And then the question the board will ask is, have they ever managed anything of this size before? Can they deliver on this type of program? And it usually falls over.
So if you are at the earlier career stage, we'd very much encourage you to look at the Pathfinder stream.
Yeah, or a very carefully thought out, clearly hypothesis-driven, focused application.
Okay, so we've had a couple of questions around animal work and then the progression from basic science to clinical work. Firstly, how can an investigator know whether their idea, being based on a platform of animal research, is ready to move into human work? And I mean, it's a difficult question, and there's certainly no hard answer. But appropriate collaboration, it will be absolutely crucial. So we really want basic scientists with fascinating new ideas about how disease mechanism may work to translate that and pull those ideas through into experimental medicine studies in humans. But in order to do that, basic scientists can absolutely be PIs on these grants, but if you're unsure of the requisite level of evidence needed before one can embark on human studies, then we would suggest that you collaborate with people who have done just that and know where the bar is before you can move into human studies.
And remember, you know, in drug development and in toxicology, one of the big issues at present is the poor translational prediction of some animal model systems into human. So if you are going to use animal models to argue the case, there's got to at least be some suggestion that that pathway or that set of pathways are engaged in the human, because without that, it obviously may not fly. So I think this is really important. This is meant to really start from the human and possibly reverse translate rather than starting from the animal and then guessing whether or not it's going to work in the human.
So we had another question around animal studies as to whether or not any animal research can be included as part of these awards. And the answer to that would be a cautious and qualified yes, but the case would have to be extremely strong. The core of these grants absolutely has to be the human work. And sometimes that human work may then give you the target that you then wish to do a more refined experiment in an animal model, or indeed to help you generate a new animal model. And that's certainly okay in the wider aims of the grant and what subsequent awards might produce. For that bit of animal work to be included within this one grant, you'd have to make a really strong case that it is iterative with the human work, and that the human work informs the animal work and the animal work informs the human work.
As a starting point, it would be exceptional. It would be truly exceptional for animals in this type of application. So you have to work really hard to justify it.
But as a downstream aim, you know, for the follow-on project,
yeah, absolutely fine.
100%
Absolutely fine. I agree.
So another question about industrial collaboration. We mentioned earlier that MRC money can't go out to companies, and that's correct. But does that remain true when wet lab analysis required for a stepwise change in insight can only be performed by an industrial partner? Does that remain true? And the answer is still yes. If that analysis can only be done by the industrial partner, then that would be an extremely valuable contribution to the project. So for the industrial partner to do that work either themselves or in collaboration with you, the academics, that would be their contribution to the project. You know, I mean, that's their in-kind contribution that adds massive value to the project. So no, MRC wouldn't send the money out to do that. Not as a MICA, not as a collaboration. It is possible for a project to sort of outsource work and to just pay for a thing to be done by industry, and that's simply the grant paying for it to happen. That wouldn't be considered a collaboration or an intellectual collaboration around a project. That's simply just paying for a service. Can I include work on patient-derived tissue or induced pluripotent stem cells as part of the project? And the answer to that is yes. Again, we must emphasize that the core of the project should always be the experiment in live, intact humans. Now, tissue derived then from those patients on whom you perform the experiment, and then subsequent characterization, entirely fine, as long as the intact human is at the core of this.
So you could take the tissue, you could derive the stem cells and then characterize pathways, but you have to complete the cycle. So there has to be a link back to the human, and ideally an experiment in the human. If you got to the first bit of just characterizing the stem cells, then actually I suspect it wouldn't fly beyond that, because that's a project or a program grant application.
Okay, so I think that is about all, folks. Thank you very much for your participation. I think if there are subsequent questions, I'm happy to address those offline afterwards, and feel free to remain in touch.
Good. Well, thank you on behalf of everybody here. We've enjoyed the interaction. I must say we've been very encouraged by the enthusiasm that the research community has taken up in engaging and coming through with these exciting and important questions. And it serves for us to wish you every success in your outlines and through to the next stage. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.